Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It is Tuesday, June 23rd, 2026. I'm Carlene Johnson, the Center Square Washington's state government reporter. And in today's episode, state employees are about to get a raise. A 2% bump takes effect for tens of thousands of state workers come July 1. Even as negotiations are underway right now for what their next raise will look like. It's every couple of years they go into these closed door negotiations. Now, you may recall the Office of Financial Management here in Washington recently said we're in a grim budget projection future. 7 to $10 billion potential budget deficit going into 2027. And given that state employees' salaries make up close to 30% of the entire state budget, will that play into how these negotiations go? We'll have some perspective from Washington Policy Center's Ryan Frost on that. And then we are down to the final 2 days of when we expect to get rulings from the Supreme Court of the United States. Thursday is set to be the final day for any rulings, and there are a couple of very high profile cases we're waiting for a decision from. And the one we're going to talk about today has to do with the rulings from two other states, not Washington, but of course it will have impacts here in Washington, on the transgender athlete debate. You're likely aware that here in Washington state, despite the federal directive that boys aren't allowed to compete in girls' sports and share locker rooms and bathrooms, we have a differing opinion that comes from the office of our superintendent of public instruction on that. We have a conversation that I want to share that I had a couple of months ago with two teenage girls that really become the center of the fight here in Washington state, the fight over protecting girls' sports to be for girls. And interesting that this conversation we're going to have or share with you is today, which is the 54th anniversary of the Title IX law that took effect to protect girls in sports and allow equal access to scholarships and other protections in the workplace for women. So, interesting conversation. And again, we're waiting for that ruling to come within the next 2 days from SCOTUS. And finally, we're 6 weeks away today from the August 4th Washington state primary. And in today's episode, part of my colleague Tim Clauser's conversation with one of the Supreme Court candidates, his interview with position 5 candidate Greg Miller, running against newly sworn in incumbent Justice Theo Angeles and two others vying for that same position. So let's dive into today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. So, state workers are going into negotiations, their union reps are going into negotiations that just recently got started with the Office of Financial Management to negotiate what their contracts will look like for the next 2 years. But this just comes a couple of weeks after Governor Bob Ferguson and his Office of Financial Management Director came out with a stark warning about what the budget deficit could look like going into how much money we're taking in and how much money we're already promised to pay out. We're talking about a $7 to $10 billion deficit going into 2027. Not going to be easy for this next legislative session, which is the long session. Could be dragging on very long if they can't reach a budget deal. But meantime, before that even happens, OFM staff members go behind closed doors with union leadership for there's really four main state employee unions: WFSE, SEIU, and some of the others. And the taxpayer doesn't have a seat at the table. This is all done in secret. Washington state does not allow a taxpayer advocate to sit at the table and sort of advocate for you and I about, how do we feel about negotiating these large raises for the 2025 session agreement. It was a 2-year raise of 5%. So they got 3% July 1 of last year, and they're getting the additional 2% July 1 of this year. And Washington state directly employs more than 76,000 employees across the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. And that's not accounting for the additional tens of thousands of state workers, people that work for the University of Washington. And UW has the highest paid state employees. Um, and then the rest of them, DSHS and DOT workers, Department of Corrections employees, these are some of the largest chunks of the pie for state workers. And again, with this backdrop of facing a potential budget deficit of 7 to 10 billion dollars, and these closed door negotiations taking place with union leadership and OFM staff, without the taxpayer having a seat at the table, a lot of questions. And we don't get to find out until all is said and done. And I spoke again, I shared some of this conversation with you last week, but I want to share another part of my conversation with Washington State Policy Center's Ryan Frost. He heads up their tax and budget center. And he and other conservative lawmakers have for years said, we got a problem, Washington State. Why are these negotiations done behind closed doors? Again, we're talking about up to 30% of the entire massive state budget is going to pay state workers. And it's like Joe Taxpayer, you went out to dinner with all the state workers and they said, "Oh, at the end of it, by the way, you didn't know you were paying the bill. Here's the bill." And "Oh yeah, we didn't tell you that every state worker ordered steak and lobster, but it's on you, Joe. Sorry, this is just how it works." That's kind of how these negotiations go. And Ryan Frost at WPC has some concerns about that. He also raises um, the interesting point that maybe there's a conflict of interest here because you have these giant state union negotiations taking place when all these union dollars go to the very people that the negotiations take place with.
If you look at who they contribute to with all their money, it's going to the people they're negotiating their upcoming raises with, and that's just a rather large conflict of interest. And it's been an issue for a number of years now. The fact that these negotiations are hid behind closed doors. If you look at the growth in overall comp just over the last 4 years, it's been about a 30%. The state spends about 30% more on its workforce today than it did in 2022. And I totally get it. It's not that I want public employees to be broke and make no money. It has nothing to do with that. It's just the state is broke, and there has to be trade-offs. And right now the trade-off is we're funding the compensation increases and we're cutting like pretty important programs that people are relying on.
So we shared with you last week how much some of the highest paid state employees are making, and this is based on 2025 salaries. University of Washington's head football coach makes the most, 5.9 million last year. It shows he actually took a pay cut from 2024. He made nearly twice what the head UW men's basketball coach made, but the athletics director and a lot of other, athletics UW employees, assistant coaches, and that are all making well over $1 million. And then Department of Corrections makes up another big chunk of the budget for state employee salaries. Um, there are more than 9,000 workers in DOC. They operate, 11 prisons, 1,300 reentry centers, and, the top DOC workers are the ones who are the nursing staff, and they, face a lot of, uh, it's a dangerous work environment. So there are several hundred DOC workers that are making two, three, $400,000 a year. Good chunk of that's probably overtime. And then there's DSHS, and the Department of Children, Youth, and Families falls under that umbrella for that state agency. They're the largest state agency, and that's another big chunk of the budget. We had DCYF Secretary Tonna Sen rather paid 244,000 plus last year. There are several hundred DCYF employees making upwards of 150, $200,000 a year. Now, obviously, state government services to the most vulnerable are critical, and many of those employees should, many could argue, be compensated well for the work that they do. But given the spending problem that the majority party has in Washington state and these ongoing negotiations for how big of a raise they're going to get for the next 2 years, it's pretty critical that we find out more, if at all possible. And open government advocates have been trying to kind of sound the alarm on this for years to no avail. Unfortunately, at this point, there doesn't seem to be much of an appetite for opening up those negotiations to, the taxpayer who would like to shine a little bit of light on this. But really, once the negotiation's a done deal, come the 1st of October, governor comes out with his budget and he has a look at it. Lawmakers then only have the opportunity to say yay or nay. It's an up or down vote. They don't get to go back on the employee salary negotiations and say, hey, wait a minute, we don't think 5% is good. We can only afford really 3 or 4%. Go back and renegotiate. No, it's an up or down vote at that point. So it's really interesting how that process happens here in the state of Washington. Is interesting today with my article coming out on the state employee salaries that the Department of Retirement Systems put out a notice to state workers today saying, by the way, July 1 is when your new pay hike kicks in. State employees, you're going to notice you got that little 2% pay hike on your latest couple of paychecks. And here's what we think you should do with it. They're telling them they sent this notice out that says, this 2% is meant to help you with the cost of inflation. And one of the best things you can do is to pay off some of your bills. They suggest things like this: use your pay bump to pay off your credit card debt. That's always a good idea. Save for a vacation. They say maybe open an account or add to your kids' 529 college savings fund. That's the state's college savings program. Um, I'm going to include this in my article to be published today on our Washington, the Center Square page. But state employee compensation has risen by about 30% since 2022. That's only 4 years ago. 30% increase in state employee. Some of that is the numbers of state employees that have gone way up. Some of that is also because there are some great big pay raises and a lot of overtime for state workers. It's also interesting to notice that that is exactly how much of the total pie, it's up to 30%, the total piece of the pie, the state budget that goes to salaries. So I just found those numbers to be pretty interesting. And I did reach out to the 4 largest state employee union, the presidents of these unions that go into these closed door sessions and said, "Hey, what are you asking for? And because of this deficit projection, are you going to maybe say, oh, let's not go in for the 5%, let's only ask for 3% this year because we're not likely to get our 5%." I only got one response, and I want to make sure I get this right. That was from the Professional and Technical Employees Local 17. Their leadership responded, said they were unable because of the negotiations to grant me an interview today, but they did ask for a list of questions and promised a response, which I will include in my article. But if I do, in fact, get a follow up interview, which I have since gone back and said, hey, I'd still love to get you on video, I will include that in our podcast episode on Wednesday, in fairness to them, to, say this is we're lobbying for our members to get more, and this is why we think we deserve that. All right, moving on. So today, June the 23rd, is the 54th anniversary of the Title IX law. This was the one that guaranteed girls would have equal access to the same opportunities in school, in the workplace, in educational scholarships, and of course, in sports. This said that, we're not just going to have boys' teams in sports, girls deserve just as much time, attention, financial interest as boys' sports. And it's interesting that this comes in the same week that we are expecting a huge ruling from the Supreme Court in a case out of Ohio, and I believe that it's Idaho and Virginia, the 2 states that they kind of combined those Title IX challenges before the Supreme Court. And they said, you know, should transgender athletes be competing in girls' sports? Should we have biological males who identify as girls being allowed into our girls' private spaces? And of course, this has huge ramifications for every state. The Supreme Court of the United States makes a ruling like this, it impacts everybody. And I wanted to revisit part of an interview that I had with the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Rakedahl. back in early February. I had a chance to sit down with him and he granted me, it was about 25, 30-minute long interview one-on-one where I asked him a lot of questions about this because he's pushed back with a directive to the 295 public school districts in the state of Washington that says, don't, don't agree with the federal directive. You don't have to say that only girls can be in sports. If boys identify as girls, you have to allow them to compete. A lot of school districts have pushed back on that and said, no, we're not going to comply with that. We're going to comply with the federal directive. So they've faced some threats from OSPI. So I asked Chris Rakedale about that and specifically asked him on his continuing resistance to comply with Title IX. I want to ask you because the Republicans held the listening sessions on Tuesday on the two initiatives. I know I was told that you were invited and some other folks that are in opposition to the initiatives, but why did you opt not to go?
Well, I don't think we were invited to those, but
I was told your office was invited.
I think they did a general they put a big thing. Everyone come, but it was their rally.
Well, I'm not talking about the rally, the listening sessions afterwards, which, because the bills aren't getting hearings. There were a lot of folks there. Might that have given you an opportunity to sort of hear from some of the folks that
I've heard. We get lots of feedback from folks.
Okay.
And I've read the initiatives and we're very familiar with them and they're similar content of the initiatives prior and the testimony last year. Listen, these are going to the voters, which is, I think, what the sponsors wanted. They want these to go to the voters because they're confident they're going to pass. That's exactly what they're getting. And so they can keep fighting in the legislature whether to have hearings or not, but it doesn't change the fact that the voters know what's in these. And there's going to get ample time to look at all those. And there's going to be a vote on those and probably litigation. And so those have got their own path.
What about those the two girls that have been most vocal in the movement? I know they've asked and called you out, like, we want to meet with you, sit down and hear our story because they feel that they have been victimized in all of this. Have you considered meeting with them, or would you be willing to sit down with them and just hear their story? Because, they've had impacts because of the policies.
There's no role we have in trying to address what happened when one of them used a derogatory term or called out at somebody. Like, there's something that happened in a local school district that's the local school district to figure out. I meet with students all the time on both sides of this. I'm happy to. I am not aware that they have said we would like to come meet with you or have a video call with you. I'm willing to do that.
Okay.
To listen, because I listen to everybody,
Right.
But it doesn't change the fact that there is an initiative out there that people are on both sides of, and the voters are going to get to decide, and then it's going to get litigated very likely.
Right.
So.
Now, it was after my conversation with Chris Rakedale, Superintendent of Public Instruction here in Washington, where he agreed that he would meet with the two girls at the center of the fight. And to OSPI's credit, he did follow up and agreed to meet with the two families. Annalie Wilson and Frances Stott became the faces for this because these two girls basically stood up and said, I'm not okay with this." In the case for Frances, she refused in Tumwater to play against a biological male in the opposing basketball team, a boy who identified as a girl. And then in Annalie's case, she lost out on a state title in track because she ended up competing against a biological boy. She didn't know it was a biological boy at the time. And we've talked about any number of these cases, but these two girls really became the face of this. And they both told me in that meeting I had with them on April the 1st, we put the story up on April 2nd, a day after they had the meeting and sat down for the first time with Superintendent Chris Rakedale. And they explained to me why they felt it was so important to be public in this fight and really become the face of it, despite what it has cost them personally.
I think we keep going because this is important to us, but also like it's important to show him that we're not just gonna back down because he wants to say something that this isn't gonna do anything or I can't do anything or that doesn't matter to us because I know that he can. So
I will say for me, we know we're right. Like we know this is the truth. There are men and there are women, and men should not be competing in women's sports. And I think it's a lot easier to, when you know you're doing the right thing, to stay with it. Despite the backlash that people have given us, despite him being against us publicly, when we know we're right, it can help a lot. And I will bring up with faith, having God is such an important part of my life. And I know you as well. It's that can keep us going, having families and so many people. This isn't just us thinking this and having these feelings. Many people have told him publicly that they don't agree with it either. And I think that when we, like I said, when we know we're doing the right thing, it makes it easier. As children that we're saying this, and as a grown man who has a position of power in this way, that he's not doing anything, I think it makes me feel good, at least, to know that I am continuing on with this, because he's not doing anything about it, so we might as well.
So again, we anxiously await this ruling from the Supreme Court of the United States, one of the most highly watched and anticipated decisions to come out in the whole, transgender debate that we have been waiting for. So we expect that either tomorrow or Thursday. We were watching for it this morning to see if it would come down, and we will have reaction from these families when that reaction comes down. And then also want to remind you, of course, we've got the ballot initiative. We have IL 26 638, which is on this November's ballot, put up by Let's Go Washington, asking Washington state voters, do you think boys should be allowed to compete in girls' sports? Do you think that biological boys who identify as girls should be in, your daughter's locker rooms and bathrooms and other private spaces? So voters are going to weigh in. But of course, the Supreme Court of the United States really has the final say on this, and we expect it to happen this week. And finally, we are exactly today 6 weeks from the Washington State August 4 primary election. I can't believe it's coming so fast. And there are 5 Supreme Court races on the ballot this year, which has never happened before. It's unprecedented. And those are more important than ever, of course, with the fight over the income tax being something that our state's Supreme Court is likely to be weighing in on. And my colleague, Tim Clauser, has been spending quite a bit of his time studying the 5 Supreme Court races, all the challengers, and interviewing as many of them has been willing to respond to his interview request. So we want to share part of an interview he did today with one of the candidates for the District 5 position currently held by Justice Theo Angeles, who was appointed by Governor Bob Ferguson back in March. So here is part of Tim Clauser's conversation with Greg Miller, candidate again for position 5, and specifically about potential conflicts with campaign donations for the sitting justice to those who have put him into that position.
You brought up the appointment of Theo Angeles, and I know there's been some questions around there, as well as Justice Colleen Medley, kind of with their recent appointment, the timing of the income tax, and kind of support that they have from the AGO and Governor Ferguson and Senator Peterson. With Theo Angeles, he's donated to the governor's campaign in the past. He's donated to Peterson's campaign, and all three had worked together at K&L Gates. I was wondering, aside from the general appointment process, which could be made, that argument could be made with any appointee, not just Angeles, or his relationship.
Well, not necessarily. And let me give you a little bit of background that maybe you don't have. My first judicial boss, Judge Gross, second, actually, because I had an externship with Judge Kuhnauer when I was in law school. But Judge Gross had been the legal counsel for John Spellman when Spellman was governor. And so I learned a lot about what the legal counsel of the governor does and what their role is in appointing. And they basically had, and he talked about how before and after his term as legal counsel, a continuing relationship with other legal counsel to the governor to basically put into a place, keep it out of the political process and have what amounted to pretty much a merit selection type process, so that it was not politicized. It was very intentional. It went from, it had Dan Evans and Rossellini and, Gardner. It didn't matter. It didn't matter if they were an R or a D. They played it the same way. And he invited me to put my hat in for his seat when he resigned. and I talked with the then legal counsel, who's our current attorney general,
Mm-hmm. Nick Brown.
Nick Brown. And what my recollection, and this was 10 years ago, 12 years ago, was that they were still doing the same process in Governor Inslee's process, at that point in Governor Inslee's terms. So that if to the extent that they're not doing that now, that would be a change.
Now, my colleague Tim Clauser again is giving equal opportunities for all of the candidates, either side. Of course, Supreme Court races are nonpartisan races, but you can tell by where campaign donations come or political activism from the past where most of these candidates come down. And he's also going to have an interview with candidate Dave Larson, the conservative candidate for position 5, who's garnering a great deal of campaign donations this time around. You may recall when he ran in 2024, he came pretty close to earning that seat. So running again this time around, and there's a lot of focus on candidate Larson. So Tim will also have that interview, and we'll be sharing that with you in the next couple of days here in Washington in Focus. Thank you for watching this Tuesday, June 23rd episode. Check out our Center Square Washington page for these articles and more. I hope to see you again on Wednesday.